Hi, I'm Dr. Marilyn Clark-Silva. I'm one of the percussion professors here at GCU, and this is the Regional Xylophone Etude. So for this etude, one of the very most important things is that you figure out your sticking first. Now, the two places where the sticking is the most crucial is in that downward run starting on G in the second line, and then a similar run at the very end that starts on A. For the first one, I recommend that you start with your right hand, then hand to hand till you get to the C sharp, double C sharp to D, then continue down hand to hand so that your hands don't get tangled up at the bottom of the run. That way you can also make that B natural a target point for your left hand. So when you're playing it at tempo, there's a place for your eyes to go. Now for the last run, I also recommend starting with your right hand at the top. Notice how there's a lot of accidentals in this, so practice this one in chunks, so like the first half of the run, then the second half of the run. And again, you can make that B natural a target point for the left hand. And then it continues down all naturals. I recommend doubling the E natural and D natural at the bottom. Right hand on F sharp, and then ending on G. I encourage you to avoid the urge to try to just play this from the beginning to the end a bunch of times. You're just going to be wasting your time and also potentially learning some bad habits into the piece. Take this in 1 to 2 measure chunks and get your sticking right the first time. Do the same sticking after that so you're learning muscle memory, and include dynamics and articulations as you learn. It's much harder to add those in later once you've already learned the muscle memory of the notes and rhythms at tempo. Now, one point that people might get caught on is those rolls at the end of the second line that are forte piano. Make a note that the very last one is just piano. So we have forte piano, forte piano, forte piano, piano. So there's no accent on that G. So make sure you don't put an accent there, otherwise you'll likely lose points. Another thing the judges are going to be really looking for is the stroke. So anytime you're playing xylophone, we really want to keep the strokes light and the stick height low. That way you can really make it expressive by bringing it up a little bit when you're crescendoing and bringing it down when you're decrescendoing. All those crescendos and decrescendos are going to be the difference between someone just getting an okay score and getting an excellent score and making it into the honor band. So those are my recommendations for the xylophone etude. So this xylophone etude is quite quick. It's not as fast as some of them have been in the past, but definitely it needs to move. There is a lot of doubling in this etude, so I'm not going to tell you every place where you might need to double. I'll leave that up to you to decide either on your own or with your private instructors. But the first thing you want to do is make sure you figure out what sticking you're going to use and use it every time you play it so that you're not reinventing the wheel and you can really get the muscle memory going. There are also a lot of accidentals in this, so that's going to determine where you put those doubles. It's always better to double from an accidental to a natural moving downward rather than the opposite direction, because you have gravity working for you and moving towards the body, which always takes less energy than moving away from the body. The other thing you want to make sure that you do with this, because it's in 2/4, but there's a lot of notes in the bars and there's a lot of skips. So it's not all scalar motion. It's mostly movement where there's a lot of skips and jumps between the notes. Take 1 or 2 bars at a time, work them very slowly with your metronome on subdivisions. And then once you feel very comfortable with it under your hands, you can start to slowly bring the metronome up. Please make sure you don't skip this step and feel like you need to just play it at tempo, because once you have it really comfortable under your hands with the dynamics, articulations, sticking, rhythm, and notes, getting it up to tempo is not going to be a problem at all. You also want to make sure that you have this sort of dance feeling to it, because it is very syncopated, and that needs to come across in your playing. So those are my recommendations for the All-State Etude. So for the regional snare etude, pay really close attention to the sticking that you use so that you can put all of these accents on your dominant hand and put the flams on your dominant hand. So because there are triplets in this, I recommend for that first triplet, starting it with your non-dominant hand so that you can start the next 16th notes with your dominant hand and put all those subsequent accents on that hand. For the next triplet, the next 2 where it's a flam and 2 notes, I recommend doing a dominant hand and a double. So then you can again start the 16th notes after that with your dominant hand. Whenever you're playing concert snare, make sure that you are setting up the snare switch right in front of you. This is very important because that'll mean that the snare bed runs right along straight in front of you, and as you're moving in and out away from the rim, you're playing along the snare head. If you're playing off, you get a much different sound. And you want to make sure that both hands are playing about in a quarter-sized area so that you're getting an even sound between the sticks, not having one off of the snare bed and one on. So that's going to give you a much better chance of having the hands sound even. As you're playing this, the dynamics are super important. It really moves from forte to piano and back and forth with some sforzandi. So when you are playing the louder sections, you want to be playing just forward of center of the drum. When we play right in the center, it gets kind of a slappy sound. Just forward of center is going to give a really full forte, fortissimo sound. As you are moving towards a piano or pianissimo, you want to move towards the rim, towards the edge, which is going to naturally give a softer sound. Now, depending on the drum that you're playing, there's a sweet spot. Now, this drum and this drum head is pretty good, so I can get really close to that rim to still get a snare sound. Some drums, you'll start to get some thin overtones there without much of a snare sound. So whenever you're playing on a drum, give a couple taps to make sure that you aren't going to go past that area where it sounds really good at a pianissimo level. An important thing here is as you are doing the decrescendo roll in the second line towards the rim, you're going to start in the center and move the sticks all the way to the rim as you're playing that roll. And on the rim, it only comes down to mezzo piano, not all the way to pianissimo, so you don't have to worry quite as much about getting it super, super low. We do want a contrast between that section and, again, where it comes down to pianissimo in that second to last bar. For the All-State Snare Etude, I'm going to answer the biggest question first, which is how do you play that metric modulation to 6/8 in the last line? Now, this is really written this way as to kind of trip you up a little bit. If you notice, it says that the 8th note equals the 8th note. That means the quarter note also stays the same, and those 2 bars can easily be counted as 3/4 rather than 6/8, and you can keep your beat the same that it's been in the previous bars. So you're really going to count those 2 6/8 bars as 1 and a 2, 3 and a 1E, 2E, 3E and then it moves right into, with the 16th notes staying the same in that next bar. So don't let that trip you up. It's not actually as scary as it looks. Now, just as with the regional etude, you want to make sure you have the snare switch right in front of you and you're playing along the snare bed. Whenever you're doing a crescendo, start towards the edge of the drum on the opposite side away from you and move towards the center. When you're doing a decrescendo, start in the center, moving towards the edge. Now, there are a lot of flams in this first line, and the first 3 have accents. The next one does not, and the 5th one does have an accent. So I recommend doing the sticking like this. Playing the first 3 flams with your dominant hand, so I'm right-handed, so I'll go right, 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 then dominant hand for the unaccented note, and then back to your dominant hand. That's going to naturally, when you're at tempo, give it that less of an accent, because it can be difficult to do an unaccented flam in the middle of this fairly fast section. So it'll be, and that's going to make it a little bit easier to accomplish that. Now, for the sextuplet in that 4th bar, you'll start that with the right hand, and I recommend starting then the triplet, that 16th triplet, on the left, so you can end back with your right hand or your dominant hand, moving into those 16ths, so then the accents can also be arranged with a lead hand sticking. Moving into the pianissimo triplets. The way I'm doing this is alternating the first set of them, and then for the broken triplets, playing them all with one hand, and then also playing those flammed triplets with one hand as well, so I can keep them very light and very consistent. If you try to alternate at this pianissimo level, it's going to be more likely that some notes are going to pop out. So I'm doing them all triplet, triplet. And that makes it a lot easier to keep those super, super consistent, which is something that the judges are going to be looking for. Now, the last thing that you want to pay attention to is going into that broken sextuplet before that very last roll. So I would recommend doing it with dominant hand, and then dominant hand again. So just as if you were playing a full sextuplet, leaving out the one hand, so then you're not getting yourself mixed up on what hand is going to start the roll. So there's my recommendations for the All-State Etude. One of the hardest things about preparing these timpani etudes is making sure you get enough time on the instruments. So if you don't have a lot of access to timpani to practice on, here's what I recommend that you do. Figure out what sticking you're going to use first and where you're going to do the dampening, and I'll talk some recommendations about that in a moment. And then at home, set up 3 practice pads or 3 pillows and get the muscle memory of your sticking and dampening down. And then also play this etude on either the low end of a marimba or a piano, so you get the sound of it in your ears, which is going to make tuning a lot easier. Now, for the sticking, there's a lot of direction towards that A flat, so I recommend trying to arrange it so you're doing that with a clean hand. Now, how I'm doing these first 2 bars is left, right, right, left, left, right, left, right, right, left, right, left, left, right, right, and then left again on that A flat. Now, I also recommend these 16th notes. Here's how I am doing the sticking. Right, right, left, right, left, left, right, right. So that's a good thing to isolate away from the drums if you don't have the opportunity to practice it on the drums. So you can move super smoothly when you do that and make it very light. On timpani, the technique is completely the opposite from snare playing. On snare, we're interested in the bounce and the buzz on the head. We play with palms down and a lot of back finger movement here. Timpani strokes are up strokes, where ideally we're having the stroke go down through the head and then come up higher than your starting playing position. So we're really getting a lot of resonance. So when you are playing very softly, think about your stroke being similar to, say, touching a hot stove, where you're going to be just very, very light with it, really bringing it up out of the head. These grace notes are not done like a drag you would on a snare where we go. They are done alternated, similar to how you would do on a marimba or a piano or a similar melodic instrument. So right, left, right is going to give much more the sound that we're looking for. Now, the dampening in this one, ideally, whenever you have a rest, that's where you want to do the dampening. So pay attention to that second line. Starts out, it's still piano, so don't be fooled by that accent, where we have accent and then dampen. Most of the dampening here happens on rests, so you want it to be rhythmic and happening in time. There are a few places where you dampen as you play the next note, doing this type of motion, and you'll want to just practice that to make sure you're not dampening early. The dampening motion is splayed fingers coming at an angle to the head as much as possible. Now this etude, those dampening sections are pretty fast, so you want to just work on that to do the best you can. You may have noticed, because the microphone is right above me and we're very close, Timpani Masterclass, you can hear a little bit of my fingers touching and leaving the head. That's something that won't be heard from an audience. So it's similar to, say, a guitarist where you can hear their fingers moving on the strings. Very similar to that, but that's something that's, unless you have a microphone right over you, is not really going to come out into the audience as long as you're not doing a slappy dampening stroke. Now, I recommend not dampening for these quarter note triplets so you can keep them nice and fluid, and make sure that those half notes towards the end, you don't cut them short. You may have noticed there are some times where I'm dampening more than one drum. That's because we get sympathetic vibration. So if I play this drum and then dampen it, you're going to hear this one still ringing. So if possible, I want to dampen at least 2 drums. So there at the very end, I do this roll, sforzando accent, and then I'm dampening both drums so I don't have anything still ringing. And there's my recommendations for the timpani etude. So for this all-state timpani etude, you notice I am sitting. That's really a personal choice for a lot of timpanists, sitting or standing. I usually play standing, and for the regional etude, I did play it standing. However, for this one, because there are 2 fast pedal changes, you pretty much have to do it sitting, so you can have your feet prepped on the pedals, ready to do those changes as soon as you've dampened the drum. So those pedal tuning changes are really the key to making this successful, and it is super fast. So it's half note equals 84. I recommend practicing it with the quarter note. So up to tempo, it's quarter note equals 168. Start with the metronome slow, get your muscle memory going, get the places you're going to do the dampening, get those pedal changes, and then start to work it up to tempo from there. So the way I am doing this is starting with my left foot on the pedal of the 29. I am using 29, 26, and 23 for both etudes. It fits on both, and it just makes it easier if you're using the same 3. So I have that prepped so that as soon as at the end of that first line I dampen, the beginning of the first line, I dampen that A and D, I can immediately tune down to G. Now, best practices for timpani is always tuning up to a note. So generally we want to bring the pedal down and then back up to our target note. However, here there simply is not time for that. And since that G is pretty close to the lower range of this 29 timpani, you might not even have that much room for the pedal to be able to pedal up to it. So just bring it down to the note and do your best to hit it on that G right on. As soon as I have done that, I take my left foot off, move my right foot to the 23, and then I play the end of that second line, dampen, and then as I'm playing the first bar of the third line, I have my hands playing over here on the 29 and my eyes looking over here so I make sure I'm getting the pedal to the right spot. And I am using gauges for that. Ideally, we'd be able to use our ears, but there just is no time to tune with ears in this etude. So if possible, use gauges. I'm using a little bit of tape since there aren't actually any gauges on here. So we do what we need to for that. But playing in tune is much more important. So this etude is super, super fast. Ideally, we want to be able to dampen whenever there are rests, but here for a lot of it, it's just not possible. And since most of these notes are consonant, they sound good together. So the G and the D sound good together, and the G and the E, the A and the E, the A and the D, they all sound consonant. Really the only ones we have to deal with in terms of sounding dissonant would be the top 2 drums with each other. But a lot of those places where there would be dampening, it's quiet, so we don't have a ton of dissonant ringing happening. The places I am dampening is that second bar. I'm playing right, dampen, left, dampen, roll. Then dampening again both the 29 and 26 after that fortissimo roll crescendo, dampen. Very important that you dampen there. I didn't quite catch the dampening quite so well when I played it, so we did hear a little bit of that pitch bend. This is another thing that as long as it's very slight is not going to come out to the audience too much, but we do want to do our best to get the dampening to happen. But the other side of that is if you press too hard to dampen the note, you will make the pitch bend with your fingers since it's a large surface area, and timpani heads are basically strings. So it's sometimes going to be a compromise on how we make that happen. So then you play this next section, it's nice and quiet, dampen again the bottom 2 after that G and D, tune the top to the G, and then I'm not dampening again until right before these pianissimo notes, and then I keep this hand on this drum so I don't get any sympathetic vibration. Now these accents in the last line, an accent decrescendo, just as you decrescendo, bring those notes out just a little bit, but don't worry about them being really popping out accents. That's not really the goal it's looking for. The accents should decrescendo along with the rest of the notes, just be slightly above them so that we get that effect. Now, when you're playing the double stops, make an effort to not have it be flammy. We want them to be hitting as much at the same time as possible. And that's another reason why, because this is so fast, you don't want to try to be doing a bunch of dampening because it's going to make your technique a little bit messy. So those are my recommendations for this timpani etude.